The Era of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1876. Nationally, reunion and reconstruction in the aftermath of the Civil War involved division and confrontation. Radical Republicans advocated full civil rights for freed persons to include citizenship, the franchise, and education. Moderate Republicans and Northern Democrats held other views on the future of the post-Civil War Union of the states, while Southern Democrats sought to reestablish pre-war political structures. In Texas, Confederate surrender led to the disintegration of the army and government. Chaos prevailed as disbanding soldiers ransacked arsenals and government buildings, along with confiscated Confederate public property. On the same day the U.S. troops occupied Texas, June 19, 1865, General Jordan Granger declared all slaves free. In Texas, the day of emancipation became Juneteenth, a traditional holiday among black Texans today. During the war, Texans played an important role in protecting slaveholders' property by providing a safe place for bondspeople, and Texas' proximity to Mexico provided the Confederacy revenue from the sale of Southern cotton. Although Texas emerged relatively unscathed physically from the war, the state still experienced financial distress as property values depreciated. Unionists and Northern sympathizers, persons who had been harassed and denied liberties during the war, sought revenge. U.S. President Andrew Johnson, a Unionist Democrat from Tennessee, called upon all seceded states to declare secession null and void and to cancel the debt incurred during the fighting, acknowledging the wrongfulness of the war, and to approve the 13th Amendment ending slavery. The majority of Texans were permitted to assume previous civil rights, but high-ranking former Confederates were ineligible to participate in the restoration of home rule. Just as the Republican Party had been torn asunder, so the Democratic Party divided into two distinct factions. At the national level, Unionist Democrats resembled Congressional Republicans in their support of freedmen's civil rights and agreed that the U.S. Constitution did not permit secession. Conservative Unionists and conservative Democrats opposed granting any freedoms to blacks beyond emancipation, and they continued to defend the state's right to secede. Unionist Democrats lost out when James W. Throckmorton, a conservative Unionist, was chosen as convention chairperson in Texas. The convention declared secession illegal and repudiated the war debt. Although the convention accepted slavery's demise, the 13th Amendment was not approved by the voters of the state until 1870. Blacks were denied the franchise and access to public office, jury participation, and access to public schools. Conservative Democrat leaders worked to limit civil rights for blacks and stood against black equality. Racial tensions mounted in the South with the enactment of black codes to maintain social and economic order. In Texas, the Constitution of 1866 further clarified restrictions imposed on freedmen, serving mainly to keep African Americans as a cheap and controllable labor force. Texans resisted change in the social and economic order, and they also resisted the efforts of the Freedmen's Bureau to aid African Americans in the transition from slavery to freedom. The Bureau, determined to build administrative centers at the grassroots level, encountered difficulties and local resistance. By 1870, however, significant strides had been made in the field of education. The Bureau also attempted to provide relief and health care and to rectify grievous instances of injustice. Some Bureau agents were inept and disinterested in their work, but the majority of the agents provided exemplary service in rendering the needed assistance to the areas of blacks communities. As radical reconstruction began in July 1865, 5 districts were created in the former Confederacy. Radical Republicans controlled the Congress and passed the Reconstruction Acts. Congressional Reconstruction demanded that the former Confederate states draft new constitutions, with all races allowed to participate in selecting delegates to the constitutional conventions. The Radicals barred former Confederate officeholders from voting. Historians once interpreted Radical Republican policies supporting complete civil and political rights for African Americans as an excuse to strengthen the Republican Party and to neutralize Southern racial hostility. Today, most scholars support the theory that radical Republicans did truly desire to bring about a meaningful change in the South. Republicans in Texas invited black political participation. The most prominent black leader was George T. Ruby, a teacher and traveling agent from the Freedmen's Bureau and organizer of local chapters of the Union League. However, violence against African Americans and intra-party conflicts weakened the Republican Party. The issue, ab initio, ultimately decided in the Supreme Court in Texas versus White, March 1869, aroused contentious debate at the Constitutional Convention. The Constitution of 1869 granted suffrage and general civil rights to black Texans, extended support for public education, increased the power of the governor, and prohibited land grants for internal improvement. Only about 450,000 federal troops served in Texas from 1865 to 1870. The soldiers, though stigmatized as outsiders, helped registered voters, blacks and white, protected freedmen and agents from Ku Klux Klan, enforced martial law, and guarded against Indians in the western frontier forts. Edmund J. Davis, a radical Republican, was elected governor in December 1869. He supported ab initio, the approval of the 13th and 14th Amendments by the seceded states. In the contest for governor, Davis barely edged out Andrew J. Hamilton, a moderate Republican who had fled north during the war. George T. Ruby's efforts in marshaling the black vote through the efforts of the Union League resulted in over 37,000 blacks casting their ballots in 1869. Once the election results went to the U.S. Congress, a bill restoring Texas to the Union was produced. The 12th legislature was composed of diverse elements: several radical Republicans, Democrats, moderate Republicans, and 2 black senators, and 12 black representatives. 2 prominent black leaders, state senators, were George T. Ruby and Matt Gaines, a self-educated former slave who became a Baptist lay preacher after the Civil War. Governor Davis's top priority was restoring law and order. Other goals included funding a statewide school system for both blacks and whites, subsidizing internal improvements, and increasing frontier protection. Scalawags were prominent in the Davis administration, and with their support, Davis was able to accomplish the stated goals. Radical Republicans did not attempt to overturn long-standing economic, political, and social mores. They were not nearly as radical as they had previously been judged. Social segregation arose immediately after the war, not, as generally assumed, towards the latter part of the 19th century. Social customs imposed social segregation, not legal dictates. Sharecropping kept blacks and whites enslaved to debt. Poverty diminished opportunities and provided dismal living conditions. Disease was prevalent, and without proper medical attention, uh, mortality rates among blacks, particularly infants, was high. Blacks sought to strengthen the cohesiveness of their own communities and to protect their cultural autonomy by building their own schools and founding their own religious institutions. While the Bureau remained in place, black marriages were legalized, grievances were brought before the Bureau courts, and blacks found some redress from Republican direct court judges appointed by Governor Davis between 1870 and 1873. Black Texans pursued every viable form of employment. Black women sought jobs in white households. Some black men found work in East Texas's burgeoning lumber industry. Others joined the state police or militia in the early 1870s. Some black Texans managed to found successful businesses or enter professions, such as teaching. On the West Texas range, a few black men made their mark as cowboys, while white society generally restricted blacks on cattle drives to the role of cooks or wranglers. Black cowboys could well earn respect among fellow drovers. Lawlessness and violence dominated the period of Reconstruction through the 1890s. Historians have tried to explain the violence by citing the bitterness arising out of the Civil War and Reconstruction, but Indian warfare, banditry, racial tension, unrest among agrarian and ranchers, and the unsettling aspect of modernization and a closing frontier were also instigating factors. Vigilante movement surfaced in a region bounded by Houston, the Hill Country, and Dallas-Fort Worth area. Some were family feuds, while others were community conflicts. The most notorious was the Sutton-Taylor feud, stemming from the bitterness of the Civil War. Lynchings by white cappers, white racist vigilantes, motivated the legislature to pass anti-lynching laws in 1897, but the measures did little to deter racially motivated brutality. The turmoil of the Civil War era permitted the Comanches to regain control of the Western Territory. The U.S. government responded with a continuation of the policy of displacement. A line of defensive forts was reestablished, but the forts were spaced too far apart to effectively curtail Indian raids. Colonel Randall Slidell McKenzie led a new U.S. Army military offensive that followed the Salt Creek Massacre in 1871. Destruction of Indian pony herds and entire Indian villages had its intended effect by 1873. The frequency of Comanche raids decreased markedly. The last remaining Plains Indian tribes lacked farms or an efficient infrastructure to stem the relentless tide of white settlers pushing westward. Disease, alcoholism, and a new reliance on consumer goods acquired from whites eroded traditional skills and culture. But the most devastating factor was the destruction of the great buffalo herds. By the 1880s, the Indian peoples were destitute, with no other choice but to relinquish their independence. The, the Texas Cattle Kingdom era began as the Civil War drew to a close and lasted until the mid-1880s. Once new stock restored the war-depleted herds in the North, the price of beef skyrocketed. The Chisholm Trail, the Great Western Trail, and the Goodnight Loving Trail were marked and posted. By the late 1870s, land and cattle companies dominated more than half of the rangeland and livestock in the South Plains and Panhandle. Even so, Texas cattle drives did not stand the test of time. Severe winters and extended droughts in the mid-1800s dealt the final blow, with barbed wire becoming the symbol of the modern cattle industry. Edmund J. Davis did much to strengthen the state's economy and social infrastructure. During the gubernatorial race in 1873, Davis campaigned on the programs that he had initiated in office. Richard Koch, an ex-Confederate, ran on the promise of redemption, to redeem Texas from the Republican rule, to restore strong states' rights, and to overthrow the coalition of Republicans and freedmen. Koch appealed to business interests, endorsing railroads and industrial expansion, while winning the support of patrons of husbandry, the Grange. Koch's redeemers blamed the Republicans for the agricultural depression of 1870. As Davis prepared to transfer his office to Koch, the election was declared illegal on January 5, 1874, by the Texas Supreme Court in the case of Ex parte Rodriguez. While Koch and the Democrats pursued plans to take over the government immediately, Davis wired President Ulysses S. Grant. By the time Davis received Grant's non-committal reply, Koch had already been sworn in as governor. Reconstruction was dead in Texas. Hoping to eliminate all traces of Reconstruction and overturn Republican successes on behalf of blacks, conservative Democrats demanded a new constitution aimed at restoring states' rights. In 1875, Koch called for a constitutional convention. The new Constitution of 1876 included provisions that prohibited the state from chartering banks, empowered the state to regulate corporations and railroad companies, established a state debt ceiling of $200,000, placed a strict limit on the maximum ad valorem tax rate, and weakened the public school system. The convention also chose biennial rather than annual legislative sessions, and concluded its business by striking down a poll tax, repudiating voter registration, and denying women the vote. Both Grangers and conservative Democrats opposed compulsory school attendance and the property tax if it meant using tax money to educate black children. The convention did, however, mandate segregated schools, and in a positive sign for the future, endowed a permanent school fund with revenue for the public domain. The new Constitution was approved by the electorate in a better than 2-to-1 margin. Although never considered a remarkable document, the Constitution of 1876 still serves present-day Texas. Two serious attempts to write a new and more modern Constitution have been vetoed.